So let me start this video with a quick story. Once, when I was living in a house different from this one, I lived in the attic. It was like this sort of old-fashioned listed building, but the owner had converted it into a cheap rental property, and for a few years I shared it with an alternating cycle of 3 to 4 other people. And while I lived here, my room was right on the top floor. And like I said, it was basically the attic, right? Like at one point, that's probably exactly what it was meant to be, and was likely never intended as a bedroom. Even if it did have a standard door entrance, it didn't feel bedroom shaped, it felt storage shaped. It was quite spacious left and right, but had like this really low ceiling, and it always did leave you feeling somewhat remote from the rest of the house. All the other bedrooms in this house were on one floor, and then up another 2 sets of stairs you get to my room. And my room was the only thing on that floor. It was the whole floor, in effect, bar a strange small cupboard-like door within the room that led to what looked like an even smaller, far less habitable attic, filled with darkness, spiders, the trash of past renters, and exposed, uneven flooring. A door that I quickly taped shut and put a table in front of because, no thanks. So for all intents and purposes, weird spidery portal to hell aside, this room was the entire floor, and it was at the very top of the building, separate from everything else. Now, I don't believe in ghosts, or the supernatural, or anything of that ilk. But that room, being so sort of weirdly condensed, so high and isolated from the rest of the house, and so open and wide to make up for its low ceilings, made for a setting that perhaps lended itself to an easily overactive imagination. This room would get very dark at night time, really dark. And on more than one occasion, when I'd lay in bed in what felt like so far away from the lives of everyone else, it felt like someone would be watching me from the corner, like an unwelcome presence had awoken me in the middle of the night, as if my body had been disturbed from its slumber simply because some deep caveman or animal-like part of my brain intuitively sensed a threat and kicked me into this instant fight or flight mode. And as I'd lay there, at some ungodly hour, heart fluttering in a jilted, unfamiliar pattern, staring out into the blackness to assure myself there was nothing there, I would often think I would see someone, something, standing in the corner of my room, watching me. Now, I was never sure what this was. I don't know if it was the faint shadow of some piece of unfortunately placed clothing casting the shape of a figure and letting my mind play tricks. I don't know if it was the after-image of some nightmare in my brain I was waking up from that I still hadn't quite shook off. But it happened. By no means regularly, but often enough to disturb me. And while I am never sure of what caused this unsettling feeling, or what, if anything, was the figure I saw in the dark, I do know that on one night, at some ridiculous hour I can't be certain of, when all my other housemates were either out for the night or staying with a girlfriend or back home visiting their parents, one night I awoke, not to darkness and not to silence, but my TV at the other side of the room, blasting static. A TV that had never done this before, but seemingly came on by itself. The remote that could have powered such an action, clearly in view, sat apparently undisturbed on the table in front of it, lit by the jittery white glow of the scribbly nothing on screen. And I remember sitting there, in that moment, sat up and shirtless in bed, the room so cold at this time it felt like it bit my skin. I remember looking over at that TV set, the one now casting a sea of scattering, dancing shadows against the floor, the one sat at the other side of what felt like a now impossibly large room, the one that stood next to where I would always imagine I'd see a figure in the dark on those strange nights. And I remember feeling, for reasons I simply could not understand, that I was in danger. Then had 2 terrifying realizations. I had to leave the relative safety of my bed, walk over to that television, the one so far away and next to the corner of the room that I never wanted to walk by at night, and turn it off. That was the first realization. The second realization was that once I turned off that television, I would lose the only source of light in the room and then have to walk back to my bed, turning my back to this strange occurrence and return in complete darkness. Why am I telling you this? Because the closest explanation I can give as to how it felt to watch Skinamarink, the topic of today's video, is that Skinamarink made me feel like I was back in that room, back in my bed, alone and wondering how that TV could have possibly came on, and that maybe, just maybe, that thing in the corner I kept seeing wasn't my imagination at all. Maybe it was real, and maybe it wanted to hurt me. Skinamarink is an almost impossible movie to describe. It is so intensely unorthodox in its approach to storytelling that it's as much a feeling as it is a film. Obviously, all movies want to evoke emotions, but they traditionally do so via clear indications of plotting and characters and story. They tell us what's going on and why we should care. Skinamarink, though, seems like it wants to almost solely create a vibe and an atmosphere to evoke these emotions, far more than it cares about doing so through a traditional narrative structure and conventional storytelling. And don't get me wrong, this movie isn't so abstract as to not have a plot. It has a plot for sure. The premise of the movie is actually a fairly simple but ingenious and terrifying concept. It follows two children who wake up in their family home in the middle of the night only to find that their parents aren't there and that all the doors and windows to the outside world have disappeared with no explanation, and they simply do not know what to do. However, to be honest, you'd be forgiven for missing that setup entirely. I don't particularly want to tell you much of what happens in this film because I truly believe it needs to be experienced to be understood, but I'll give you that much context as I am aware that there are some viewers who have seen this film out there who went into the movie blind just on word of mouth recommendation and hadn't read the synopsis and didn't even get that that was what was happening. So unconventional is the manner in which this story is told. Like almost any other movie, Skinamarink does have plot and characters and dialogue, but Skinamarink barely ever even shows us a character's face. We just get distorted voices and grainy images of the backs and legs of lost and scared children wandering around equally grainy and distorted images of a 1995 house. This micro-budget experimental horror film made on only $15,000 in Canadian director Kyle Edward Ball's childhood home released to an incredibly divisive reception, and it's fairly easy to see why audiences were so discordant on it. I actually think Skinamarink is, as far as experimental films go, quite accessible. However, there are significant chunks of this movie where you will exclusively see long, static shots of empty, grainy rooms. That is not an exaggeration. So much of this film is, at its most basic assessment, exactly that. Just empty, grainy rooms. Rooms, I may add, that are often lit so dimly and shot at such weird angles that you're not always sure what you're even looking at. You might get 40 seconds leaning into a shot before you go, oh, it's carpet, that's carpet, that's like a banister, I see it now. The pieces of the story are told not through extended conventional narrative discussions between clearly established characters, but through fragments of voices often heard in other rooms or just out of frame, or by characters who don't ever face the camera. Our two child leads often can only be told apart by the fact that one wears socks throughout the film and one doesn't. As often, the only part of them you'll see in frame will be the cautious tiptoe of nervous legs. Its antagonistic force is unclear, uncertain, and abstract. Often its evils are something that must be interpreted as opposed to seen. Dialogue is minimal and gives little exposition. Plot points are often illustrated almost entirely through abstractions, such as the way the sound a repeating cartoon makes becoming somewhat integral in understanding one of the film's most shocking moments. It can be quite difficult, not just in terms of understanding its narrative, but also in terms of the actual content it discusses. It's potentially hard to understand what's even happening And if you do manage to understand what's happening, it's still always in a way where the actual content could have multiple interpretations, and almost every one of them is relentlessly bleak and cruel in a way that might just really not vibe with people. And yet some, myself included, think it's kind of a masterpiece. Its biggest detractors will tell you that it is a slow, boring slog of often barely legible images, one that plays out with all the static and crawling intensity of a PowerPoint presentation with some jump scares sprinkled in. And honestly, I get it. I do not begrudge anyone for coming away with that thought, because in a way, it's kind of not entirely inaccurate a description. There was a point while watching this movie for the first time where I thought I was going to agree with its negative critics. Its unwillingness to seemingly do anything for long periods, its meandering pacing, its obtuse and confusing imagery and narrative left me feeling kind of hollow to the whole thing at first. And I would not blame anyone for hating it and thinking it's kind of pretentious. But I'm here to tell you that if you can stay with it and get on its wavelength, it can hypnotize you. I don't know at what point it got me, at what point it clicked. I don't even think there is a point, so to speak. There isn't some big light bulb moment where the scary gets switched on so much as it is this slowly building, all-encompassing vibe that pulls you in. Watching Skinamarink had me feeling like I was watching a nearly 40-minute long slideshow of still images of grainy rooms, and then somewhere along that slog, it became the scariest film I had ever witnessed without me even noticing that transition. It's like, have you ever gotten lost? Think about that feeling. You know how when you get lost, you never actually get lost at the point where you realize for certain you are lost. It's not like one single unfamiliar turn and then you go, oh yeah, I'm lost. It's more this mounting feeling you don't even really notice in you at first. It's one wrong turn you didn't even realize was a wrong turn. It's reassuring yourself, no, I think this is the right way. This looks kind of familiar. It's discomfort and uncertainty slowly starting to creep in, and then it's, I'm not sure I came this way before. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, and when you're too far away from the point you went wrong to even recall where exactly it is you went wrong, it's, oh God, I don't know where I am. That is what watching Skinamarink is like. At least it was for me. I was bored and unimpressed, and then there was a point when the kid was following a mysterious voice we'd never heard before, compelling her to come upstairs, and I noticed my heart beating that little bit harder and thought, wait a minute, I'm terrified. When the hell did that happen? By the closing act of the movie, I was praying for the credits. Not because I was unengaged, but because I felt like I couldn't take another moment of this paralyzing dread and tension this movie had built up in me. The incredibly cruel way it torments its child leads, done in a way where the worst horrors inflicted upon them are left almost entirely to your imagination, stuck with me for weeks. It still sticks with me. It's why I felt compelled to write this video. And look, I do not think horror needs to be scary to be good, and I'm not one of these people that holds up not being scared by a horror movie as some kind of badge of pride, like I beat the challenge the film was posing or whatever. So I don't mention this to in any way champion myself as some kind of fearless alpha male or horror movie defeater, as people often do when engaging with the genre. But I will say, I have literally never been scared by horror the way this movie scared me. Just never. As someone who, you'll be able to tell from this channel, has obviously engaged with a lot of horror material, I haven't felt a sensation even close to this from any kind of horror medium since I was a literal child. The last two times I remember anything close to this, I was genuinely a kid. The first was during a moment where I was way too young to watch Scream, but had stayed up without my mother's knowledge a great deal past my bedtime and managed to stumble upon and sneak in a late night viewing, having had extremely minimal exposure to the genre before and discovering this strange, scary and violent forbidden fruit. And the second time was when, as a young lad discovering the wonders of the internet, my friend sent me my first experience of a creepypasta story, basically horror fiction scared across the internet for those not in the know, under the pretense that it was real. In both instances, I felt like I was watching or reading something I wasn't supposed to. Like this was very much stuff that had a dangerous aura, that these stories were somehow not safe to engage with. Obviously now as an adult, I just see these things as exactly what they are. Scream is a fun and entertaining meta slasher, and creepypasta is just a cool creative outlet for online writers that often get shared around. But that initial feeling on their discovery was one I'd never soon forget, and one that I never came close to feeling again until I encountered Skinamarink. It too has that feeling of being something you aren't supposed to be engaging with. A lot of horror strives for that, with their grimy settings, excessive cruel gore, and snuff film-like aesthetics. But whenever films go for this kind of feeling, it often comes across like they're trying too hard. I never personally vibed with the filthy, gory excess of franchises like the Hostel series or the Human Centipede films, but Skinamarink, a movie that only ever implies violence as opposed to directly showing it, a movie that refuses to even linger on the image of a character's face, never mind the wounds they endure. A film set not in a disgusting basement dungeon or dishevelled abandoned warehouse, but rather a place that more or less resembles any normal 1995 family home, made my skin crawl. It's so unusual in its presentation, so cruel in its implications, so abstract in its delivery, that it feels like a kind of forbidden artifact, like something alien. Like stumbling onto a strange website that leads only to an oddly named .mov file which when viewed feels unsettling and invasive and uncomfortable for reasons you can't even put your finger on. Or like finding the real life equivalent of the VHS tape from The Ring. Feels like something cursed, like something evil and sinister, like something you should not be watching but cannot take your eyes away from, and I love it. As cruel as this film may be to its child leads, it is so appropriate that those characters are that young and not the teens and adults that usually make up horror film casts, because this movie makes you feel like a kid again, and resurfaces the long dormant memories of just how terrifying an experience that can be, when the world feels so big and strange and incomprehensible and scary. Those moments where you can just feel lost and confused and where there's no adult around to guide you and you just have to make sense of this strange reality you found yourself unwillingly existing in with only a loose concept of its rules and how it all really works. Everything about this film is so deliberate in how it captures that experience. There's a point where you suddenly realise that all of its unusual quirks make total sense. That grainy obscuring of its visuals, those always low-angled shots, that's how the kids feel. The movie makes you feel small because they feel small. The movie makes you feel uncertain of what you're seeing because they're uncertain of what they're seeing. The lights are off because they can't even reach the switches. And without an adult to guide them through this process, their family home becomes this labyrinth of darkness where every blanket of black that coats the corridors could hide a malicious presence. And the film is so great at making you feel this because it literally tricks you like your brain would trick you as a child. Once you're on its wavelength, then you start to actually think, did I just see a face there in that grain? Is that a figure? Or am I imagining things? There's so many times in this film where focusing on an empty room leads to so much dread. As you scan the place for any hint of danger, your mind constantly confusing the grain or a shadow for a potential threat. Just as a child might wake up in the middle of the night and mistake the silhouette of a jacket as the monster having crawled out from under their bed. I don't feel like I watched this movie so much as I endured it. I ended my viewing experience literally drenched in nervous sweat, and I can honestly say that is something a horror movie has never done to me before. However, I do equally think that if I'd watched it in even slightly different context, it might not have landed for me. I intentionally watched this film under very specific circumstances. I watched it late at night, in the dark, phone switched off and put away and completely and totally alone. I didn't watch it with my partner or a friend or a family member. I watched it by myself when the rest of the world had seemingly all gone to sleep. And maybe I'm wrong, and I would have had just as much of an intense reaction to it under a different set of circumstances, but I feel like this particular viewing experience lended so much to assisting the vibe that this film was executing. That feeling of isolation, of being cut off from the rest of the world and from anyone that could come save you. This viewing method, I feel, adds so much to the vibe of the movie that this is absolutely how I would recommend experiencing this film. I swear to God, at one point with this setting, this film managed to get so much under my skin that I felt the whispers of the film leak into reality, as my own unexplainable house noises felt like part of the ongoing narrative and made my silly caveman brain question just how safe I was. I'm just saying, think about that story that I told you at the start of the video. Would I have felt so scared in that moment if I could hear my housemates chatting about something downstairs? Probably not. It's kind of how I feel about Skinamarink too. Feels like a solo experience to me. Or maybe a cinema endeavour where no one is going to pause the film to break for the bathroom or popcorn. Where everyone is in this unanimous agreement that the film gets their full, undivided focus and attention. Or at the very least that if they have a potential break in attention, that it will not in any way take away from the attention others are giving it. Personally, I'm not sure you can get that in an environment where someone sitting on the same sofa as you might check their phone during its slow and lengthy opening act, or where you might giggle because your friend jumped out of their seat, or you have to get up because the dog needs to be let out or something. You get what I'm saying. This film demands your full, undivided attention, and so much of its effectiveness relies entirely on it executing this strong, all-encompassing vibe that you'd be doing yourself a massive favour in making that vibe as easily tuned into as possible. Think of it like lighting a candle for a romantic dinner, only the candle is self-isolation and the romantic dinner is willingly torturing yourself into a desperate clawing fear. It's a good time. I recommend it. And you'll notice in all this praise and discussion around its presentation and artistic choices and how the experience just generally makes me feel, I haven't actually said too much about plot, although I easily could. And that's because I honestly think if I did do a full analysis on this thing, I'd need like at least an hour-long dedicated video on just that to cover the depth of its implications and multiple interpretations. But I still have a bunch of other stuff to cover this season, and right now, don't have time to do that. Maybe if enough people who've seen the film want that, it's something I could revisit long after Wholesome Halloween, but also, to be honest, I don't really want to say much more about the film other than how it personally felt to me, because I don't want to give anything away. And that's not like an I don't want to give out spoilers thing. I just truly feel like this is something to be experienced and interpreted on your own terms, rather than first experiencing its narrative through a YouTube analysis. And I know a lot of you, I'm willing to even bet possibly the majority of you, will not have seen this yet. So if you think you can handle it, do it. I honestly think it's an incredible and important title in the canon of horror fiction, and I really do recommend it, quite heartily. But I will say I recommend it to a very specific person. I know I've covered a fair bit of weird and more off-the-wall stuff on the channel before, so this isn't the first time I'll say this film won't be for everyone, but honestly, more than any other movie I've covered before, this film really won't be for everyone. A good litmus test would be checking out some of the director's shorter movies they have on YouTube, especially their film Heck, link in the description, which was the proof of concept movie that eventually developed into what Skinamarink is now. Also, if you understand why something like the internet's current obsession of exploring the horror potential of liminal spaces or something like the backrooms is compelling, then I think you may be on the right wavelength to potentially really get a lot out of this. The way the film not only explores spaces but feeds into this exploration of this kind of uncanny, uneasy nostalgia and weaponizes those feelings of familiarity against you in unpredictable ways is very reminiscent of this kind of growing movement of analog horror that subverts nostalgic aesthetics, often in an interestingly distressing manner, and it really feels like a film that's not cashing in on current horror internet trends, especially since Kyle Edward Ball has actively been a voice in the formation of those developing ideas, but rather functions as the culmination of what these explorations and ideas have been leading to. Total side note I've been thinking about with regards to this actually, it'll be really interesting to see how that Backrooms movie A24 is developing with James Wan turns out. Because I'm wondering if they're going to go down the much more conventional narrative path, or now, after seeing Skinamarink's success, they might try something a bit more weird and unconventional, but far more in line with the aesthetics and vibe of its source material. I don't know, I guess something in between those 2 points, but closer to the former if I'm honest. And while I'm sure it will still be good if they do go down that more traditional path, I gotta say, if that is the route they take, then Skinamarink will be a better Backrooms adaptation than the Backrooms adaptation. Even though conceptually, Skinamarink is actually not at all that similar to the Backrooms at all. They just feel like vibey companions, if you get me. And yeah, anyway, that's Skinamarink. It makes me feel horrible, like a scared little child and I love it. But we still have plenty more to cover, so once again, as always, remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, comment with your own thoughts on the film, really want to hear what you all think of this one if you've seen it, and subscribe to my Only Dans at the red button below and hit the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. And once again, may I just remind you lovely people that this year's Wholesome Halloween is a little extra wholesome and is being run in aid of the charity Trans Lifeline, which offers direct emotional and financial support to trans people in crisis. Please, if you can afford to, make a direct donation to either of these charities, links in the description. And I also have a Patreon you can support, and all of my Patreon income for this month, as well as all of my ad revenue, will be going directly to this charity. I will say though, if you have to choose between supporting my Patreon and doing a direct donation with the donation button, please choose the direct donation, as the charity will get a little bit more money off of that. I'll also be selling these shirts. Well, not this shirt, this is just a mock-up so you can see the illustration that's going to be featured, but the final design will be a much larger screen print on a high quality organic shirt from one of the UK's best suppliers. And all the profits from this will of course be going to charity too. Also, unrelated to these charity efforts, did you know 2 other cool things are happening right now? Firstly, if I'm still in the competition at the time of this vid's release, I am running once more to be this year's Face of Horror. You can vote for me once every day for free, or buy more votes if you're so inclined, and doing so will help the B+ Foundation, which funds childhood cancer research. And finally, did you know that I'm actually a accredited advisor on the next entry in the smash hit In Search of Darkness series? I don't think I've ever mentioned it. This incredible horror documentary saga is making its first foray into the 90s decade, and as an advisor, I'm able to offer a 10% discount on this film. I'm genuinely thrilled to be working with the In Search of Darkness team. It's going to be a banger. Check all this out and more at the links in the description. Other than that, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to my Only Dans with the red button below, hit the bell so you don't miss the next vid, and I will see you all again tomorrow.